Hi all, I'm Bill Arney, I'm the director here at the museum, and thank you for coming out on this marvelous warm afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome David Getsy here, who's down from Chicago, where it is significantly colder than here, so hopefully he's enjoying the weather as well. It's really a pleasure to introduce David. I first got to know his writing when I was working on, we did a few years ago for the 65th anniversary of the museum, we did a series of exhibitions on the current state of abstraction. And I started looking at theory around abstraction and where things about gender, sexuality, and biography came into the discussions of abstraction, and David came up right away. So I started reading through his writing, and I got to meet him in Chicago. And his writing has been very, just absolutely riveting and fascinating. First long chapter I read was the one which you sent me on John Chamberlain, and which is in this expanded form in the new book. And I've never looked at those sculptures the same again. There's an excitement when I see them now, which is just and a new understanding of them. As well as the new book, Abstract Bodies, that he'll be signing downstairs after the reading, which is Letters with Bodies and Sexuality. He's also just issued a new anthology called Queer, which could be used as a course reader or a sort of field survey of queer theory in art history. And also one of my his early books have been on Rodin, and one of my favorite was a book he edited and wrote a marvelous introduction of the essays of Scott Burton, because I've had a lifelong obsession with Scott Burton myself, and worked at a museum for years that had a great set of Burton benches in the lobby, and I've always wanted to learn more, and I learned more in his introduction than from almost any other source I've seen of Burton. So it's with great pleasure. Also, I want to thank our collaborators at Rice for helping make this happen. I hope this is the start of a number of upcoming collaborations. I want to thank the group over there, and now David Getsy.
Great. Okay, good. Well, thank you all for having me here today. I'm really happy to be speaking here at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston. With its commitment to new ideas, it's really an honor to be part of that program. And again, I'd also like to thank Rice University, in particular Gordon Hughes and Brian Rydell, who are hosting this visit, and a special thanks to Bill Arney, who made it all happen. So, now, today, in sort of celebration of my new book, I'm going to go through some of the terms around the book and explain kind of what the book does. I'm not going to do a summary of the entire thing. It's a 400-page book that would leave us here forever. But what I will do is kind of give a kind of sense of how the interpretation of canonical works of art is happening in the book. I'll give an example from one of the chapters. But then I also want to extend this into the contemporary, and I'll talk about one or two artists who kind of enact some of the logics of the book in the contemporary frame. So, Abstract Bodies talks about the ways in which the pursuit of abstraction and non-reference in the 1960s produced accounts of gender's multiplicity and mutability. In the 4 case studies in it, I show how the attempts to purge representation were nevertheless couched in metaphors of the human body and of personhood. The collision between abstract sculptures and these ways of talking about them compelled viewers, critics, and the artists themselves to nominate these works in relationship to the idea of the human. These nominations, I argue, were predicated on attempts to assign gender. The abstraction of these works, however, resisted or exceeded those assignments and endlessly called for more. Abstract sculptures, that is, called forth questions of the human while nevertheless refusing to offer an anchoring image of it. What happens, in other words, when the body is invoked but not imaged? One answer, I argue, is that abstract bodies are proposed, and with them, new conjugations of genders as multiple and mutable. Abstraction itself has capacities, and it facilitated, sometimes inadvertently, new accounts of gender's relation to the body and to personhood in the 1960s. So this book aims to do a few things. The first and most important is that it argues that all art histories must be reconsidered from the perspective that genders can be mutable and are multiple. That is, from the perspective argued for by transgender studies. As I'll discuss in a minute, the reality of transgender lives and transgender history compels us to look differently at our accepted ways of thinking about such questions as figuration or personhood. And what I do in this book is to argue that transgender studies matters, and that it demands that we reconsider the history of art and its relationship to the human form. I'll just remind us that the history of art is preoccupied with the relationship between figuration and abstraction, with what counts as an adequate representation of the human form. And so a perspective that demands that we attend to the complexity of the human species and to the inhabited genders of it are necessarily part of that history of arbitration of what counts as an adequate or viable representation of the human. So I make this case throughout the book by taking on what is an admittedly risky task. I deal with canonical artists to show that their commitments to abstraction can themselves be reread and mined for the counter-narratives that they come to propose. And ultimately, I'm interested in how earlier artworks and art practices contain the seeds of such a counter-narrative, despite the artist's own intentions. Now, this isn't to say that I disregard what the artists have to say about their work or their practices. And in each chapter, I try to understand and characterize an artist's practice on the terms that they themselves put forth for their own words, their own texts, and their own objects. So, for instance, when I'm talking about Dan Flavin in the lower right, I discuss the importance of his titling practice, which is almost never talked about in art history, and the importance of the personal dedication that he appends to these works that are meant to be interchangeable and modular and multiple. I talk about artists like David Smith and his commitment to visual openness in his work and the way that this manifests itself in the objects themselves. But after I discuss the artist's work on their own terms, I then ask how we can exceed those intentions. How can we build on those ideas and the logics that they propose? And in particular, this collision between abstraction and the metaphor of the body or the person. What happens when these things rub up against each other? And I argue that we can discuss these works as proposing new ideas for how gender can be visualized differently. So again, it's this kind of attention to the object and the specificity, but then the belief that we should move beyond that. Now, of course, there will be some conservative critics who demand that I stick to the artist's intentions, and who could never imagine that such figures as Flavin or Chamberlain could be used in this way or have to say anything progressive at all. Such attempts to keep interpretation at bay ultimately try to invest all authority for art in the artist, and they deny the usefulness of artworks to other artists and to viewers. Art continues to have importance based on the ways we use and adapt it, and we cannot be limited to its original meaning, its original context, or its original maker. And my argument is that when we ask how genders can operate in different ways in art history, we can also find different sites of capacity from which to build different futures for art. We find different places to identify in that history. So in keeping with this focus on the future, I'm going to end with discussing an artist, a contemporary who manifests this and does that. Now, artworks propose meanings beyond what's intended, and such inadvertent possibilities are important to uphold and to seek out. And really, when I say that these accounts are inadvertent, I quite literally mean there are moments of shock or acceptance by the artists themselves when they come to face the gender multiplicity that their work produces. And I'm really interested in dialogical moments when an artist will be talking to a critic or another artist, and this other person will discuss the artist's work in relationship to gender in in a way that's opposed or different from what the artists themselves intended. And it's this moment of realization that the work is doing more than the intention by the artists themselves. And so I'm going to go in detail about this, talking about a very odd quote from David Smith, where he said, "I don't make boy sculptures, they're all female sculptures." This is ludicrous, and we're going to talk about it, so don't worry, but it's fascinating why it's ludicrous. But I also think about artists like John Chamberlain, who, when asked by the museum curator Henry Getzaler about the coexistence of feminine qualities and colors in his seemingly butch sculptures made from crushed automobiles, and he's like, "What do you think of this?" And Chamberlain responds to say, "Everybody's both genders." Now, these are moments of recognition because the work itself is doing things beyond the intention. Or similarly, Nancy Grossman, who's another of the case studies, has a moment where she says things like, "I think I'm specifically female and male, and so is everyone. I've lived long enough to see both men and women shift." And this is, again, a response to a question about how her objects are working. Now, so quite simply, what I argue for is that once we accept the historical reality that bodies are mutable and genders can be multiple and successive, the history of art's negotiations with the human form looks very different. The artists themselves saw this after the fact in these cases. Transgender studies as an intellectual formation and as an academic manifestation of real-world politics demands a substantial reconfiguration of our conceptions of personhood, relationality, and the social. It is a historical reality that gender is multiple, bodies are mutable, personhood is successive, and variability, rather than consistency, is ubiquitous. Our accounts of the human, of sexuality, and of the interpersonal must all be rethought through evaluation of mutability and of particularity. Most directly for the history of art, it demands a revision of the history of that struggle between figuration and abstraction and modernism. Now, the 1960s provides a particularly rich decade in which to pursue these questions. This was the decade in which objecthood and literalism emerged out of commitments to abstraction, as well as being the decade in which the statuary tradition finally ceded to a wider range of sculptural practices, often colloquially referred to as the expanded field. Engaged spatial relations, dynamic materialities, and transformed objects took over the conventional forms of the statue and sculpture in this decade, and the body of the viewer was activated by sculptures which refused to offer illusionism or symbolism over the confrontation with the abstract assemblage or the literalist object. The pursuit of completely abstract or non-referential objects was buttressed by these activations of viewers as embodied participants in space, and sculpture leaned heavily on the physical relations established with the three-dimensional forms that it presented. Now, I focus in particular on the first half of the 1960s, when sculptors pushed against the self-contained sculptural object, but had not yet opened up into installations and spaces. Now, I give this kind of quick overview of the art theory of the 1960s to remind us that this is the decade in which sculpture committed to abstraction and non-referential objects in a much more extreme way. This decade, however, is also the decade in which a widespread popular awareness of transsexuality and gender transformation grew. So I'm going to pause for a second to discuss this wider historical context. Now, it's really important to do this because some people assume when they sort of read the blurb on the back of the book that this could never be anything other than anachronistic. How could one look to the 1960s and see evidence of transgender capacity? What I'm interested in doing is again, thinking about the ways in which these capacities are always part of history. But the 1960s, again, it's actually not very hard to establish this, because the 1960s, much like our current decade, was a decade in which debates around the mutability of bodies and the transformable potential of genders were not side conversations, but central mainstream conversations. So the historian Susan Stryker has called the 1960s the decade of transgender liberation because of the rapid changes that happened in media, in institutional funding, and science in this decade. And these were played out widely. So I just want to remind us of some of this history. And initially, this begins actually in the 1950s. In 1952, Christine Jorgensen made international headlines for being the first publicly disclosed case of gender confirmation surgery. In 1954, the American magazine People Today would report, quote, "Next to the recurrent hydrogen bomb headlines, reports of sex changes are becoming the most persistently startling of world news," unquote. So soon after, by the 1960s, gender research clinics began to be founded across the country, starting with UCLA in 1962 and growing to include a host of other institutions. In 1966, the groundbreaking book by Harry Benjamin, The Transsexual Phenomenon, was published, and it catalyzed medical and social institutions to recognize and incorporate transformable gender into their discourses. That same year, the New York Times ran a front-page story about sex change operations, soon to be followed by articles in Esquire, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. By 1968, the Olympic Games, that year held in Mexico City, were the first to formally introduce gender confirmation testing because of their fears. Also, that same year, Jorgensen went on a 20-city book tour to publicize her just-released autobiography. Gore Vidal published his best-selling novel with its eponymous transsexual heroine, Myra Breckinridge. And in 1969, the Stonewall riots that launched gay liberation were sparked by the resistance of trans women and drag queens to police harassment. In the 1960s, that is, definitions of gender, sex, and the human body also moved into an expanded field. This is the content of the 1960s, and it is not anachronistic to ask about mutable genders in this decade, and that's one of the key themes that I wanted to get through in the book. Now, in the history of art, abstraction was often set against representation in the figure, and the two operate in relationship to each other. So the abstraction is sometimes understood as the rejection or the negative of the figure. And so there's always a dialogue between the two in the history of art, and especially with regard to three-dimensional objects in sculpture. And one of the things that I'm interested in, theoretically, is how any attempt in that battle between abstraction and figuration, when the assignment of the human takes place, when we see an object that is abstracting and it's called a human, it's put in relationship to the human, this is predicated on an assignment of gender. And gender is the predicate for nominating the human. Now, to illustrate this, I want to kind of move us into a kind of art history 101 moment and think about a canonical object, not from the 60s, but from earlier in modernism, but one that really sort of makes the point very clearly. Now, this is an object by Constantine Brancusi, who created a very simplified representation of the human form. We see a central trunk and with two offshoots that appear to be legs. Now, when I ask my students in my Art History 101 class, and I say, okay, so Brancusi said this was a torso. What kind of torso is it? And I will have students on one side of the room say, well, it's a male torso because it's clearly this outrageous phallic symbol. And I'll have students on the other side of the classroom say, it's a female torso because it does not have external genitalia visible. And they are both right. Both sides of the room are right in this context. And the object itself demands an arbitration, a dialogue around how we're seeing this as a torso. Brancusi himself fixed this, however, because he didn't want that kind of variability, and he made sure to call this the male torso. He has another work that's a torso of a young girl in which he does this operation again. And and I use this little anecdote in the history of art to remind us that the object itself is asking much more complex questions than the artist is in assigning a singular gender to this object. The object demands that we think about exactly what is it, what are the traits that we are using to assign gender onto this object. The artist tried to limit this. Now, this isn't because Brancusi is a bad guy or anything like that, but it's, I use this to point out how much artworks themselves contain their own logics that demand questions of the viewers and of critics and others who try to understand them, and sometimes the object exceeds the artist's intentions. So this basic idea is what I try to pursue throughout and think about other moments in which the history of art, the accepted history of art, looks radically different when you start thinking that gender is not binary, bodies are not dimorphic, and personhood can be successive. And each of the case studies in the book shows that an attention to the mutability and multiplicity of gender paradoxically gets us closer to the artist's intentions, in that we can understand certain moves differently and better, but then it also allows us to exceed and move beyond that. So let's give an example with one of the opening case study from the book, David Smith. This is Smith standing in front of two of his works in process called 90 Father and 90 Son. And we could equate these to the Brancusi male torso in that they have an anchoring title that helps assign the gender to these objects, which seem to bear no resemblance to human bodies at all, despite their verticality and the fact that they have round things on the top that we may accept to be heads. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Smith is that throughout his practice, he pursued openness as a formal and semantic trait. And one of the things he valued most was that when you encountered his objects, from each angle, they appeared different. They defied structure. They demanded that you circumambulate, that you move around it, and that they were more than the sum of their parts. Now, this is a laudable artistic goal, and one that Smith, as the great abstract expressionist sculptor, pursued with rigor and consistency across his career, making increasingly elaborate sculptures that demanded that the viewer attend to their particularity and attend to the ways in which they evoked something more than the pile of steel that they were. This makes it all the more strange that when, in 1964, under the glare of television lights, in an interview for public television in New York, David Smith sat down for an interview with the poet and curator Frank O'Hara on the occasion of a major show of Smith's sculpture, and they were just kind of going to have a chat about it. They knew each other well. O'Hara had curated 3 shows of Smith's work. They're friendly. In the middle of the conversation, Smith says this line. He says, "I don't make boy sculptures. I only make girl sculptures." Now, this is a remarkable statement on many levels. As we look at Smith's sculptures, they seem to resemble neither boys nor girls. In fact, they rigorously avoid any of the basic traits of the human form. And Smith was on record first saying how much he was opposed to the statuary tradition, how much he was trying to move beyond it. And so to have this condensed moment in which his work suddenly became locked down is remarkable. Here's just another one. I like this. Now, what I do in the chapter is think through the long history of this odd statement and try to understand it. And I trace O'Hara's relationship to Smith as an invested curator with his own ideas about how to make artworks come alive. O'Hara's quite fascinating because he's a significant poet of the 20th century who famously wrote poems after his lunch hours as a curator at MoMA. But he was invested with the idea of trying to make works animate and come to life through his criticism. And O'Hara had written a number of articles about Smith, had curated 3 shows, and a persistent theme through O'Hara's writing was how much Smith's works, despite the fact they didn't resemble people, assumed human qualities. At one point, O'Hara said, quote, "Smith's sculptures get to me, but I don't get to them. They make me feel like the world is going round and round, not knowing what's going on, or in a world we're alive." He would later write, quote, "They're like guests at a party in the meadow, and they're the sort of people who you are about to walk away because you aren't as interesting as they are, but they're not quite mean enough to do it." Right? And so these are the ways he's talking about, like these objects that seem to have all of this complexity he's walking around, and he's trying to translate this into interpersonal dynamics. And ultimately, O'Hara says, quote, "The best of the current sculptures didn't make me feel I wanted to have one. They made me feel I wanted to be one." Right? Unquote. So O'Hara is really invested with his narrative of personalization. And this is the key theme that he and Smith are kind of talking about going on. So it's not a neutral question. When they hit this interview, again, they're friendly, they're engaged with each other, and they're talking. And O'Hara asks a relatively innocent question. David Smith lived in Bolton Landing, which is in upstate New York, and had a large amount of land with multiple sculptures all over the place, including also in his house and in his studio, and the sculptures are just littered around. And O'Hara asks a fairly basic question. He'd be like, what's it like to live with all these sculptures in your house, right? Are they, are they like people? What? It's a neutral question. And Smith returns, well, they're all, returns and say, they're all girls. I don't make boy sculptures. So again, it's this moment when O'Hara, with all of the weight of his criticism around personism and personalization that's happening, asks this question of Smith, and Smith responds by suddenly seeing his sculptures as persons, and then tries to triangulate the meaning of them. Now, this is made more complex by the fact that O'Hara was widely known amongst artistic circles and was writing poetry that identified him as a gay man in the 1960s. And so the question of the kind of person you want hanging around your home was not a neutral one. And so Smith's response is actually a good-natured joke. Now, sometimes when I tell this story, people think that I'm casting this dynamic of the homophobic sculptor versus the gay critic. And actually, they're friends, and they're chiding each other on this moment, because again, it's a very casual comment that happens, and it's joking. And he's like, well, they're all girls, Frank, right? And I don't make boy sculptures. And then he keeps going, and they're going back and forth, and O'Hara goes like, well, they're very angular girls, and then, so there's literally the play that, like we have with the Brancusi in my Art History 101 class. There's the same kind of thing, like they're both talking about sculptures as if they're statues, as if they're persons, and trying to sort out which gender they see them as. And this is amplified by the fact that Smith and O'Hara have different object choices about who they want to be hanging around their house, and they're aware of each other's difference in this regard. And so that's the nature of the joke. Now, this is actually a minor incident in this interview, and it goes on, and Smith tries to recover from this, and he later says, oh, they're personages and things like that, because he realizes how awkward this was. Now, in one version of what could have happened in the history of art, this would be completely inconsequential. And this statement, this joke that happened to be captured on film would just be lost into the history of art, and we would never hear about it again. And we shouldn't. It's not actually all that explanatory. It doesn't tell us anything about Smith. It doesn't tell us anything about the sculptures. It's really odd. But what happens is Smith dies the following year in a car accident, and there is a memorial issue of Art in America produced for Smith that's edited by the artist Cleve Gray. And in this folio of pictures and statements and testimonials and criticism, therein lies 4 lines taken from this televised interview, and they are the 4 lines saying about Smith and girls. Now, this casual joke was taken as something that was then put into the Smith literature, and it becomes talked about incessantly for a time. Anytime the question of Smith's relationship to the statue or to personhood is in play, this line gets quoted. And this happens in the most extreme in the first major monograph on Smith's work, Rosalind Krauss's Terminal Ironworks of 1972, which has an entire chapter that's dedicated to proving that Smith was right when he said that all his sculptures are female, including talking about a work called Cube Totem 7 and 6, in which Krauss asserts that it has a female presence. Now, one of the things that's even more odd about this tradition that is kind of really pursuing this is that it also relies on the fact that when Cleve Bray put those 4 lines into the Art of America, they were mistranscribed. And all of O'Hara's questions and concerns about angular girls and what counts as this, that is taken out, and they're made to agree, not disagree, about the gender of these works. So I'm just going to read you the incorrect transcription, which is, again, complete fantasy. Like, this is longer statements that Cleve Bray rewrote into this. O'Hara, you must feel that there are all these strange objects around you in your whole studio or outside. Smith, well, they're all girls. Oh, they're all girls. O'Hara, yeah, they're all female sculptures. Smith, I don't make boy sculptures. Okay, here's the original. Okay, O'Hara, because he's kind of, he's just going on the fly. O'Hara, well then, conceiving a form, let's say when you look at these things and you study them, I mean, you study them since you created them, I study them and you look at them, but do you feel like there are people around your house? Are they aesthetic things? What are they? I mean, you must feel that there are all these strange objects in your whole studio. At which point Smith ends this kind of rant, not rant, but this cascade of words that O'Hara said. He goes, well, they're all girls, Frank. O'Hara, they're all girls? Smith, yeah, they're all female sculptures. O'Hara starts laughing. Says, oh, they are? Smith, I'm sure. O'Hara followed up asking, very angular girls, to which point Smith replies, well, I just don't make boy sculptures, unquote. Now, as you can see, this more dynamic conversation that's happening between them where O'Hara's being, sort of chiding Smith on saying something that's patently absurd in relationship to his works, is in Cleve Bray's version, it just becomes, they are in agreement. They have sorted out Smith's relationship to gender for the remaining, for all time. And that's why it's so interesting that this mistranscription becomes installed in the Smith literature as the touchstone around gender. And so anytime the question of Smith's relationship to the statuary tradition is raised, this mistranscription is invoked because it seems to settle the confusion around gender. Much like when I showed you Brancusi's male torso, before I told you it was male torso, I just said it was a torso, the titling or the words attached to it are a way of fixing and stopping the play that the objects themselves, or in Smith's case, the artistic practice more broadly, generates. And so I use this example, and I kind of pursue it at length in the book to show that when we ask about the mutability and multiplicity of genders, and we bring a transgender studies lens to these questions of gender assignment, we can see things that are not, that have previously not been seen in the historical record. And so what's interesting about this is that I feel that the mistranslation of Smith's words did an injustice to Smith's practice. I mean, he really was committed to, he was committed to the idea that the sculptures did work around openness and produced unforeseen possibilities. And he said words fail art all the time, but yet these words that were said in an offhand manner in the context of a televised interview became a cipher for his work by subsequent art historians. And so the argument is, in the chapter, is that a transgender studies perspective actually does allow us to see more closely what Smith's practice was, but then it also allows us to see how much those objects are proposing things far in excess of what Smith himself proposed. So again, this is just one of the chapters. Each chapter has a different methodology, a different kind of concern, but I tried to kind of hinge on some of these questions. Just to give one other quick example, just because she's the least known of the sculptors in the book. These are works by Nancy Grossman, which are these large objects that are composed of old garments and shoes. And so what she's very interested in doing is taking leather in particular and remaking things from leather garments and recombining them. And so the idea of this is an emblem of bodily transformation. The cow becomes the leather, becomes the garment, becomes Grossman's sculpture. And she plays quite dramatically with implications of gender and sexuality in some of her works. I'm showing a series of details of this work, which I understand is very hard to see on the screen. that's called Ali Stoker that is all made from black leather jackets in 1966. And again, this is a highly coded use of the black leather jacket. Some details. Or a work like Chiron, in which we have these kind of plays with gender. So in the upper left, you'll see what looks like something that could be understood as the cresting head of a birthing baby that's coming out of a men's toiletry bag. She would make sculptures that implied femininity in some ways, but were made from men's boots, and there's constantly this play back and forth. And so for me, using a transgender studies perspective for Grossman allows me to attend to these moments of complexity and also show how they were read and misread by critics who were invested in feminist reading of her work at the time. But I don't want to go through all of the case studies because I read the book. But also because I really want to talk about contemporary art too, and flash forward 50 years into artists who do this in a different way. Because I recognize again the risk and the oddness of trying to produce the ground for productive readings of the history of art from a transgender studies perspective by taking on canonical artists. But I think that needs to be counterposed with thinking about how artists who work from the resource of transgender politics and experience are operating today, in particular, and how they're mining the history of art in very productive, wonderfully perverse, and completely politically committed ways. And so I'd like to talk about this artist who's based in upstate New York named Jonah Groeneboer. These works are impossible to see on the screen, and this is the point. They're impossible to see in person. They are meant to frustrate your ability to see them and to comprehend them through vision. Groeneboer's work takes as its central theme the ethical contours and the political ramifications of attempting to see as a way of attempting to know. His works are deliberately hard to see, they're impossible to photograph, they make demands on you. At first appearing straightforward in their geometric simplicity, they reveal their formal complexity slowly, partially, and successively. He adopted the look of 1960s American minimalism, extending its activation of perception as a means to address the body. So minimalism, we should remember to offer this kind of hopelessly brief formula, emphasized formal reduction to geometric units as a means of creating a more unified, direct object that, in its simplicity and regularity, compelled the viewer to attend to their processes of perceiving. So the long-lasting impact of minimalism can be understood to derive from the ways in which it activates the space of the gallery and the viewer's place in it, and many artists have subsequently expanded on its terms and tactics to engage the viewer's relational co-presence in the gallery with the object. So Groeneboer's work draws on but does not replay minimalism, even though his sculptures might at first look like those of the artist Fred Sandbach. Now, Sandbach, who makes these works with colored yarn, draws in space, and just so as I can describe what you're seeing, this is colored yarn that's extended in these taut lines that creates the implication of a solid form, even though we're just seeing the outline. Here's one in which there are two walls. And these things, when you see a Sandbach, they produce perceptual effects. I mean, people are afraid to walk through this wall, even though it's just a line of cord, a colored cord that presents it. So it has a very strong relationship to the viewer's perception. Now, Sandbach is an example of the kind of artist that I analyzed in abstract bodies. With his commitment to abstraction and to openness, the works propose capacities and possibilities beyond Sandbach's own intentions. And in fact, this has been written about eloquently by the artist Gordon Hall, who argued, quote, Sandbach's sculptures manifest the same confusion of terms that is necessary for rethinking sex and gender. In light of this reformulation, I see them as capable of teaching us to differently perceive our own and one another's bodies, unquote. So in other words, Sandbeck could have been a chapter in the book. Gordon Hall, who's written, again, wonderfully on this, also is kind of looking to Sandbeck as mining and mining out these kind of possibilities of openness. Well, independent of Gordon Hall's analysis, Jonah Groeneboer is also someone who kind of is looking to precedents like Sandbeck and really adapting some, but not all, of the techniques and practices. And in this sense, Groeneboer's works are not derivative of Sandbeck so much as selectively appropriating key terms, forms, and artistic practices, and making them into something more directly engaged with the contemporary politics of gender. The fact of Sandbeck's intentions, that is, do not limit what an artist like Groeneboer or like Hall can do with them. Now, these works, let me just explain them for a second, are, this is a detail of one of Groeneboer's works, and they involve very thin thread that is looped through these rectangular brass rods. And as I'll talk about, they have this, some hang, some sit on the floor. But they make it very difficult to sort of perceive. Unlike the thicker colored yarn or cord of the Sandbeck, which kind of can be seen from a distance, Groeneboer's works are verge on invisibility and produce an activated struggle to see. And in this particular activation, I think there's a key comparison that I like to make, and that is with the Swiss sculptor Alberto Giacometti, whose post-World War II works took on the impossibility of fully seeing a person, even one as close as his own brother, as a recurring theme. Giacometti's attenuated statues and portraits teach us about the difficulty of encountering the opacity of another person, and they remind how external features allow only a partial view of another's subjectivity. Now, I like to think of Groeneboer's work as inhabiting the formal terms of minimalism, but animating them through the questions related to those that drove Giacometti's struggle with facing persons. Groeneboer's work, I want to argue, uses formal reduction as a means to address the complexity and variability of the ethical encounter between people. His high degree of abstraction creates a situation that avoids representation of the figure, but that nevertheless calls for an unforeclosed account of personhood and its relations. These thread works, for instance, evoke bodies and persons despite their extreme abstractions. With these delicate threads suspended from the ceiling and made taut by hanging brass rods, Groeneboer's sculptures exhibit an animated stillness as they almost imperceptibly vibrate in response to microclimatic changes in the room. The rods lend width to the shape made by the threads that pass through them. Some of the rectangular brass tubes hover just above the ground. You can see that right here. See the shadow. And Groeneboer photographs the works in this way that makes it almost impossible to give us a sense of anchoring space. The existence of the non-visible but bodily pressing force of gravity is distilled as a reminder to the viewers. We see these things that are enacting the experience of gravity. While the hovering rods of Groeneboer's works make regular geometries through their response to this force, their complex and non-regular planes are made possible when the rods sitting on the ground are placed at angles to that plumb. So you'll see the rod on the right is actually placed on the ground, allowing for a torque and a twist of the rectangular form that's created by the thread going through it. With titles that evoke bodies and actions such as bent hip and the step, the works invoke but do not image the human form and its capacities. Many of these works take on the proportions of humans when their hanging rectangular planes approach the dimensions of full-length mirrors. And in this way, they face us with the verticality associated with the statue. They are astonishingly complex, however, in the refusal to let their contours define mass or solidity, and the works appear distinct and different from every angle of approach as their faintly outlined geometries multiply and interpenetrate. It takes time to visually disentangle the taut lines from each other. Forms that had at first been seen as simply geometric transform into complex torqued planes. This multiplicity demands circumambulation rather than visual circumspection, and Groeneboer's work stage visual transitions at every turn. Now, it's hopeless to try and capture this experience in a photograph, and I understand that how difficult it is to see a digital projection of a photograph of these works. But again, this is the intentional disruption of Groeneboer's activation of visual discernment. Unlike, say, Sandbach's thicker colored string that often creates these architectural illusions or blockades, there's an intimacy to Groeneboer's thread as it escapes being seen from a comfortable distance. It requires work for the viewer to view, and the act of seeing becomes muscular in its intensity and resistance. Because of the almost immaterial and invisible presence of the thread lines, one simply cannot focus on the work as a whole. The thinness of the thread suspended in our space dissolves into the environment. That's harder to see in these against white, but imagine this being hung in this gallery and trying to focus on this narrow thread hanging in space. The background of the room competes with the taut thread for our attention. This thread oscillates in and out of focus, and the viewer must constantly strain to recapture these slight lines that subtly vibrate in space. Giacometti's receding faces and attenuated statues, just like these, the form's expected wholeness sweeps away with the immense focus demanded in order for us to see what is directly in front of us. In this way, Groeneboer offers the viewer a proposition: walk away with nothing, or do the ongoing work to see that which is in front of you on its own terms and in its full complexity. That complexity frustrates the presumption that recognition is simple, immediate, and in the viewer's control. Instead, the work's material form requires vigilance in order to be seen and even to be focused upon. There is a sophistication in this refusal to be easily legible, while nevertheless being, in form and concept, open and transparent. Remember, unlike Sandbach's barriers and walls, these are human scale, and the geometries and twists of the outline forms evokes bodies and actions. Like the mirrors with which they share proportions and verticality, Groeneboer's threadworks face us when we look at them and look through them. They confront us, however, with a form that is not easily apprehended visually and that takes ongoing commitment in order to see. A resource for Groeneboer's work has been the politics and history of transgender experience. And it's from this perspective that one can see how such formal and descriptive terms as resemblance and identicality can be understood to be politically urgent. For Groeneboer, the questions of the viewer share and the process of perceiving are not simply neutral arenas for the artist to activate. These are not just formal traits. The question of perceiving is also the terms of interpersonal negotiation and sociality. And it's from these that Groeneboer distills visual discernment into formal relations. In his work, in other words, there's an account of personhood and its ethics proposed by simple forms that nevertheless escape being apprehended comprehensively through sight. Whereas the minimalists use formal reduction to achieve clarity and universality, Groeneboer leans on those same formal traits to resist and to question the presumption that things are only as they first appear. A central theme in transgender history has been this question of appearance in the visual field. That is, how quickly appearance is used to ascribe assumptions about gender onto persons. Groeneboer's work is aligned with other artists working today who are pursuing abstraction as a means to address transgender experience and to resist the taxonomies through which bodies are read and personhood is assumed. Abstraction becomes a way to discuss social relations and bodily politics without producing an image of the body. In this way, there's a refusal of the voyeurism and scrutiny that so often hounds the representation of the transgender body. As a mode of resistance, Groeneboer's work offers an account of intersubjectivity that, like Giacometti's, upholds the inscrutability of another person. The concision of Groeneboer's works is poetic and political, for it addresses sight as the matrix in which arbitrations of personhood are performed. The threadworks stand up to the viewer's vision and remind how limited and inconclusive it can be. This performance of partial seeing draws its urgency and energy from the experience of the daily confrontation with others' sight and with resisting the compulsion to be read and to be deciphered. In this way, Groeneboer's works, with their activated focusing that's required, demands that we continually renegotiate as viewers a relation with the object that's being presented. It offers a work that is both open and transparent, but again, demanding of work and vigilance on the viewer's part, on our part, to attend to its complexity and to its particularity. It is a work that is hard to see on purpose, and being hard to see makes it political from this perspective. Now, I use Groeneboer's work as an example of how the history of art, and particularly the history of abstraction, can be mined and can be selectively adapted to create political stances that are beyond what our original sources may have intended. And this is in general what I've tried to do in the book as a whole, is to make a case that art history can be useful and can create the potential for counter-narratives and for new histories to be written. It's far from a comprehensive history of these ideas or of transgender experience, and not in the least, but it is, I hope, the beginning of, and just one attempt of seeing how much an attention to the reality of transgender experience throughout history compels us to think differently about not just the history of art, but the history of the human. So, thank you very much.